Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Cadet Second Class Rachel Perillo, and it is my privilege to welcome you to this 30th Annual National Character and Leadership Symposium speaker session. Our honored guest speaker for this morning's session is Colonel Raja Chari. Colonel Chari is an Iowa native who graduated from the U.S. Air Force Academy in 1999 with a bachelor's degree in astronautical engineering and engineering science. He continued to earn a master's degree in aeronautics and astronautics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School. He has accumulated more than 2,500 hours of flight time in the F-35, F-15, F-16, and F-18, including F-15E combat missions in Operation Iraqi Freedom and deployments in support of the Korean Peninsula. Colonel Chari was selected by NASA to join the 2017 astronaut candidate class. He reported for duty in August 2017. He was the director of the Joint Test Team for the NASA Commercial Crew Program. He then served as commander of the NASA SpaceX Crew 3 mission to the ISS, which launched on November 10, 2021. He also served on the International Space Station as part of Expedition 66 and 67 before returning to Earth May 6, 2022, completing the agency's third long-duration commercial crew mission. The International Crew of 4 spent 177 days, about 6 months, in orbit. During his time on the space station, he performed 2 spacewalks and helped in capturing and releasing 3 SpaceX Dragon spacecraft and 2 Cygnus cargo vehicles. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to introduce Colonel Raja Chari.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks very much, Rachel. And thanks to everyone for showing up today. I'm going to talk super fast to try to get through to Q&A, but the good news is I'm used to talking fast, so you should be able to understand me. But we will jump right into it. As Rachel mentioned, I'm a proud grad of the class of 99 from here at the Academy, and happy to be back and get the chance to you guys. I think it's important just to put a perspective, and this is what it looks like from the cupola, which is our favorite place to hang out on the space station. So that's our mission patch, and then the Air Force and Space Force flags as you guys turn out future airmen and guardians here at the Academy. Today, well, a little bit, what do I talk to as we go through the day and get to talk to the cadets tomorrow as well, specifically focusing on leadership and team care in space and how what we learn here on the ground translates to what we do up there. I'll talk really quickly through how I got here, and then just the constant movement between leader and follower roles and how important that is, both in the Department of Defense and even more so, I think, at NASA. And I think what I didn't realize until I was doing the mission was how much the Academy and the experience here and the experience you guys have actually prepares you for that. We'll talk a little bit what we do on the space station. We'll talk a little bit about geopolitics, since there were some interesting things that happened and are continuing to happen while I was up there, and then go into Q&A. So I always like to start with why, when I'm listening to people talk, I want to understand their background, and so I just want to take a few seconds to give you my background. So anyone who's done program management has probably heard the analogy of the stool, the three-legged stool, and in program management we talk cost, schedule, and performance. In life, there's the similar thing about the balance, and trying to keep that stool in balance. And I would think, I would wager to say that most people in the military sacrifice their family at the expense of the other things. That's definitely been my experience and my story, and so my family has bared the brunt of my decisions to serve for most of my career, and it's something I continue to try to rectify and try to do better. You as cadets are working through that now. I mean, the superintendent's pin tells you, right, the balance you're trying to strike, academics, military, and athletics, and that striking a balance is something you have to figure out how to do the rest of your life, how to prioritize, how to give 80% versus 100% at different times to different people and different projects, and know when to trade that. And when it struck me that I was probably screwing this up was in staff college. We, just like I'm coming to talk, at the time, numbers and numbers of leaders came through to talk, and something I realized that no 4-star or retired commandant or chief of staff ever said was they wish they had spent more time at work. To a T, everyone always talks about they wish they'd done more with their family, because the day after you're the commandant, the day after you're the chief of staff, the day after, pick your job, any 4-star job, the day after that, you're just a person, and you're going back to what your life was, which is your family. And so you really need to keep that in the forefront. So I still do a bad job at it, and working on it. So my path, how I wound up to be an astronaut, one misconception, I've been talking to some of the cadets today, is there's not one path to be an astronaut. So that's sort of like bust that myth right up front. There is lots of different ways, and what I tell people is if you're interested in becoming an astronaut, the worst possible thing to do is to look at my bio and say, I want to do that, because we already have me. So we need not me, we need someone different. So definitely look at bios and see what people have done, but don't try to mimic those. Do what you do. So my path, my father came from India, met my mom in Wisconsin, and then I wound up at Iowa thanks to John Deere, and that's where I grew up. As they mentioned, Rachel mentioned, was a 99 grad here, and then went on to grad school. And then went on to forget everything I learned in grad school as I bounced around. This is a very familiar picture to anyone who's been active duty. You'll see this and live this, but I think the takeaway on here is that bullet up there. So thanks to the taxpayer, I have been learning most of my life. I've actually done not that much actual real work. Most of the time I've been in training, whether that's at the academy, whether that's in pilot training, F-15 training, test pilot school, ASCAN training, a lot of training, and then also doing some work. But I think one of the cool things about our jobs is we're constantly learning. And something I tell my kids often is, you're never really done learning. I think we hear that cliche, but it's really true. And that's the fun part about the job. So like Rachel alluded to, my first job, I was a Strike Eagle pilot. Loved doing that, and up in Alaska and then in England. And then where I left, probably a test pilot's dream, getting to run F-35 tests out at Edwards Air Force Base, and that was a dream come true. And probably the only job I would have left that job for was this job. So it was hard to leave that, but also hard to say no when NASA called. So NASA training, basically starting over at age 40 and starting a whole second career. And one of the things I want to talk about today is how we have this fluid relationship, and something you're learning here at the Academy, of moving between peer, subordinate, superior roles, and how do you make that all work? And so in my particular case on my mission, I was a rookie, but then also the commander for the mission. And so knowing when are you in the commander role, when are you the pilot, when are you the engineer on the space station, and how do we move between those things for different phases of the mission. So really simple terms, ISS, I'm not in charge. Dragon, I am in charge. And so knowing how to define that role, because it's the same people that you're working with. So in certain scenarios, certain emergency scenarios, I'm supporting Tom, who was the ISS commander, or Anton, who was the ISS commander. And then as soon as we have an off-nominal situation, we're back in the Dragon, then I'm the commander. And so, and it just has to do with areas of expertise. And so the analogy I use for when you're a cadet is, one semester you are maybe a flight commander, the next semester you're the training officer. And so you're constantly changing jobs. And I didn't really appreciate that until looking back on it to realize, oh, I learned this skill without even realizing it was happening. We do a lot of, we use the T-38 as a flight trainer, and the reason we do it, and the reason to have the bullet up there about, so OMB is the Office of Management and Budget, and every year we fight this battle, this budget battle, because why are we paying to have astronauts fly the T-38s? And it's really about CRM, or crew resource management. And so that's really the closest analog we have to space flight, and specifically it's the vehicle is moving, you're making mistakes with another person, having to work through that, compartmentalizing that mistake, analyzing it, but then continuing to move on. And why that's really important is in space, the same thing happens. If you dwell on mistakes, if you kind of like mull it over and keep talking about it or let it fixate on it, things are still happening, things are progressing. And that's something you just naturally learn in the Air Force, in the military, and any operational assignment. As the mission's happening, you have a plan, you're trying to execute the plan, things happen, the enemy responds, and you have to learn from that, very quickly process it, and move on. And so we use the T-38 to do that in NASA. And I would say, so my pilot was Tom Marshburn on the mission, and I didn't know him that well when we started, and after having flown the T-38 with him a few times, it instantly translated into much more efficient sims in the Dragon, and just nonverbal cues of knowing when he was processing information, knowing when he wasn't processing information, and vice versa. So a hugely beneficial training thing, and also the same thing you guys are doing here in all the operational type things, whether it's the parachuting, gliding, the things you're doing in the squadrons, just building that ability to very quickly make a mistake and then move on. Rendezvous and docking is a thing we spend, so very similar into the Air Force. we spend the vast majority of our time training for the thing that we hope will never happen. So in theory, all of this is autonomous. The vehicle should dock, rendezvous, do all that automatically. But most of our training is the case where it doesn't do that, and how do you still salvage the mission? It's the same thing on the space station. Robotics and EVA is a place where we're constantly switching roles. So I mentioned before this very fluid leadership, followership mental model in the ISS and the Dragon. We also have the same thing when it comes to robotics and EVA, which is extravehicular activity or spacewalks. And so your roles on my first spacewalk, I was EV2, which is basically like the wingman in the Air Force construct. And then the second spacewalk, I was EV1, which would be the equivalent to the flight lead in Air Force speak. On the robotic arm, we also have similar roles. One person's flying the arm, one person's feeding that person the information, and the ground is supporting. So you're constantly moving between these things, and sometimes mid-mission on spacewalks, sometimes you may swap roles. The title may not change, EV1, EV2, but just like in a flight in the Air Force, during a target attack, maybe 2 has got the tactical lead. It's a very similar construct. And again, it's a skill set you're learning without maybe even realizing you're learning it. And then probably the biggest thing, my biggest blind spot coming into NASA, and probably the hardest thing too for me to adjust to, was changing yourself and the crew culture. And I've talked with Luca this morning and a few others over time. One of the biggest things that that we value is the teamwork and the team cohesion and what we call expeditionary skills. Because if you think about it, if spending 6 months to, if we're talking Mars missions, 3 to 4 years in a very confined space with a small group of people, it's more likely that there's going to be some kind of psychological, personal team breakdown than there is going to be a technical failing. By the time we're to our point in our careers where we are, the technical stuff is usually not the problem. It's usually the interpersonal stuff. And so coming from the Air Force, that was one of the larger mental leaps for me personally, to really buy into that, invest in it, but then seeing the benefits of that and seeing the pure joy and the efficiency that buys you in mission on the space station, on long duration missions, I'm a complete and total believer of that. And I think, again, it's something that you guys are inherently getting the tool set for, and even the fact that you're at this conference, having these conferences, is demonstrating the value that I think the Air Force and DoD is putting into this area. All right, so I'll roll a quick video. It was one of the questions I think people often have. I give the analogy, I think sometimes in the Air Force, when I would give incentive rides, people thought we have the idea that we're just like out there doing loops in the sky, like they don't really know what we do. And oftentimes I think people think the same thing on the station, like, what do you do when you get to the space station? So I'll roll a very short video. Most of it's science, though. And if this works. One more time. There we go. All right. So this is Expedition 66. As you mentioned, there's 4 U.S. members and then 3 people that came up on a Soyuz. So Mark Vande Hei was on a year-long mission. This is them launching on their Soyuz. So Mark and Pyotr did year-long missions, and then Anton was on a 6-month mission. That's in Baikonur in Russia, which we still continue to have a partnership where we launch an American on a Soyuz and they launch a Russian on U.S. vehicles. This is the Soyuz docking. This is their periscope view of what the docking target looks like and what a Soyuz looks like docked to the space station. So that's Mark Vande Hei. So when we showed up, he had been there for 6 months already and has the U.S. record for longest time in space on a single mission. This is a suit-up room at Kennedy Space Center, walkouts. This is the same place they've walked out since Apollo and Gemini and Mercury. Out to the Pad 39A, which is the same complex we built up for Apollo that's the crew access on. Tom and I walking across, and Kayla and Matthias. Kayla was one of my classmates in the 2017 class. You can see it's not just us going up there, a whole bunch of cargo. So everything below us is science cargo that's going up to the space station and consumables.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. And liftoff.
At a night launch, that's the F9 rocket. You can see the arms of the rocket.
Laboratory in orbit.
Families are right up there.
The International
That's the vehicle
Space
assembly building
Station.
where Artemis is stacked, and then our
Vehicle
immediate
is
families
pitching
are right up there
downrange.
outside of the camera view. It's a 2-stage rocket. So it throttles down. The first stage, as you probably know if you follow space, SpaceX's big innovation is this first stage flies itself back. And then about 8 minutes later, we're in free flight. We separate from the F9. open the nose cone, and then this is our view of the docking port on the station. There's a visual target and then an instrument target. So Mark's there to greet us. You can tell we're newbies because we can't control our bodies as we're coming out of the space station, so he's there to catch us and plant us into position. And the other thing to note is all the stuff. The space station is full of stuff. Every free spot there is cargo, trash, it's consumables. It is constantly a game of moving things around. So once we're up there, it's into the science. And basically every day you're working on something completely new. A lot of research right now on plant science. We know how to grow plants in space, but we are not so good at is doing it without taking a whole lot of crew time. So we need to figure out more autonomous ways to do it because we need the crew to be doing other things if we're talking Moon and Mars missions. We have all the capabilities you would have in the national lab back on the ground. So basically a super cryogenically cooled freezer. That's where we put like all the science, tissue, samples that get frozen and then eventually returned to Earth. We learn to be our own medical experimenters, so we learn to take our own blood. That's what I'm demonstrating there, is how to self-lobotomize. Basically everything that's coming out of you is getting collected, whether it's water vapor, poop, pee, spit, blood, anything that you can get out of you, they want to collect it and study it, especially as we do the long duration, year-long and beyond missions. This is an eye study that has to do with the pressure. What we think is happening is the fluid shift in your body deforms the back of your cornea. So that's an active area of interest. We know what happens. We know it fixes itself when it comes back. We don't know what happens if it's more than a year, 2 years in space as we look at Mars. This is a combustion experiment. So a lot of the high-end research we do up there has to do with materials and medicine. And the reason is that in microgravity, you can get different behaviors out of alloys, flames, things like that, where you don't have the gravity vector to change the way materials mix. Same thing in medicine. You can grow different protein crystals and look at different types of medicines that you couldn't do on Earth. This is Mark in the Soyuz hatch. The other thing we trained for and did while we were up there, this is Kayla and Tom doing a EVA to replace an S-band antenna. So we have 2 redundant strings. One of them had gone down, so they had to go out and basically replace one of the strings for command and control of the station. And so I'd say probably the physically and mentally most difficult thing we do in training and execution is spacewalks. Kayla and I did one. This is a mod kit. So we're basically upgrading the solar panels on the space station. So just like maybe you've seen solar panels on people's roofs, after 20 years, ours have gotten pretty old and there's newer ones available. So we're putting in new structure for those. The second spacewalk I did was with Matthias to essentially put in a jumper for a leaky pipe in the simplest terms. The way we reject heat is through radiators, and one of them was leaking, so we refurbished it and reinstalled it. It was getting time to send Mark back at the end of his year-long mission. We also have time for human tricks. They worked on perfecting this for a while to stick the landing. This is the Japanese module, and again, you can just see just stuff everywhere, cables. So we do spend time probably, probably the most key time of the day is in dinner in the evenings. And that's not only because we get to sustain ourselves, but that's also when we kind of share lessons learned. At least once a week, we would have a group dinner with the Russians. So they would either come over to our side or we go to their side and do a family style buffet. And then usually, schedule permitting, there'd be some kind of like movie night where we'd try to watch a movie together. It's a lot easier to do family-style meals in space. One of the things that's frustrating back on the ground is how hard it is to pass food to people versus just letting it float across to them. So it's time to get Mark ready to go back home. So this is basically the pathway to the Soyuz. It's Anton and then Pyotr. This is their Soyuz undocking. And you could also think of the space station like a giant bus station in the sky. So it's constantly got vehicles going and coming to it. So there's Soyuz, which has got the people on it. There's the Progress, which is the uncrewed version that has cargo. And then we have Dragon and Cygnus vehicles going to and from. That's the Soyuz landing. It lands in Baikonur on the ground. And it feels about like that. From what I've heard, it's about like getting like equivalent to like a 30-mile-per-hour car crash. The Russian system is, I would say, very robust. And so they pull them out of the spacecraft there, and then they split them off. Mark gets flown back on a Gulf Stream, and it's basically as soon as we are out of the vehicle, they're sticking us, trying to get blood, because your body changes really quickly after space flight. This is us undocking. Pro tip, put your visor there if you don't want the camera to see you're falling asleep. This is undock. Just like on the way up, we close the nose cone. On the way back, we drop off that. It's called a trunk. We jettison that. That's the solar panels. And then we close the nose cone and then come back in. Heat shield first. As the plasma starting to go outside the windows. At about 2 Gs on the re-entry, you can't see. It's an amazing sight, but you can't keep your head up anymore. Those are the drogues that pop out about 6 kilometers, and then the mains pop out about 2 kilometers and then splash down. There's a jet ski and a hazmat boat that come screen for hypergolic propellants if we have any leaks. That's pretty disorienting, that 90-degree swing in the water. It looks like a toasted marshmallow, which is planned. That's the heat shield, the thermal protection system ablation. And that same spacecraft is actually on the space station right now. So in the same time it took us to recover, they refurbed that vehicle, that Endurance, took it back up through 5 weeks to get up there, and they come back in March, but it's on the space station now. And Earth at night, which is always a cool sight with the lightning and awesome views. All right, so that was Fast and Furious. How are we doing on time? So I've kind of talked a little bit about some of this, but just to highlight some of the things I think USAFA prepares you for with, maybe you do already know this and maybe you don't, but the peer leadership practice is not something I think most people associate with military academies. I think most people associate the military with hierarchical styles, not flat organizations, but it's actually quite the opposite, I think. If you think about your experience in the cadet wing, it actually is pretty fluid and pretty changing, and you get used to having to quickly move between those roles. And it's definitely important in NASA, it's definitely important in private industry, it's also obviously important in DoD, but it's a skill set that you are developing that's hugely important for life. I think the other thing that is most definitely true in DoD, not so much in private industry from what I've seen, is the ability to take a chance and fall on your face and have that be okay, and not have blame laid, and just know that everyone is trying to do the right thing. I think one of the things we teach in different ways, in the flying community, we call it the wounded bird, or new jet, new day, but the idea of you have something happen, and the new jet, new day, if anyone who's been in the flying community knows immediately what I'm talking about, like you're doing a sim, you've worked through the problems, and then the sim instructor, the IP is like new jet, new day, meaning like reset, like we're done with that, move on. And so the same thing applies. On my second EVA, we had a whole bunch of problems early on with some equipment, and we actually used that same words, those same words. The flight director's like, all right, new day, new EVA, like we're almost like hit the reset button, we're starting over. And I think that's something that we learn well in the military of, okay, we screwed this up, reset, we got to get back in the game, because if we dwell on this, the war is moving on. Just hit the reset button and get with it. All right, I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but only to point out that recognizing that, and I know this is oversaid, challenges are also opportunities. But for me specifically, I think at every phase of my life there was challenges, but they also turned out to be opportunities. So here at the Academy, I think one of the biggest things I took away is there's good leadership and there's bad leadership. And there's people you may hate and people you may like. But even the leaders that you hate, there's still something good that comes out of that. Because like, I will never do that to anyone again. I will never follow that example, because that is horrible leadership. So even in those moments, realize there's something to take away from that. In grad school, I think I realized I am way over my head and I need help. I need lots of help. And that positioned me, I think, later to be okay with asking for help. And in NASA, that's something, it's actually a failure, I think, if you don't ask for help, right? Or as an instructor in the Air Force, one of the biggest things is if a student says something and you make up a BS answer, that's the fastest way to lose credibility versus just to say, Hans, there, hey, I'm sorry. That's one of the biggest ways to lose credibility fast. Just like, I don't know the answer. Let me go find out. And then where we were talking about that reset button, you are going to fail. That's okay. In fact, if you don't fail, you're probably not trying hard enough. And that's what I'm talking about here. Like, and I'm dating myself, but if you go out in a 4-ship in a fighter squad and you come back and everyone's alive, and you're high-five, like, well, why did no one die? Training-wise, training scenario. Like, you obviously didn't push. You didn't make the scenario hard enough. And it's the same thing at NASA. If at the end of the sim, we're like, that was awesome. That was super easy. Everyone was good. Obviously, we're not doing enough. We need to push harder. We need to get the team to the point of failure, and then we have something to unpack and actually figure out, like, what can we learn from that? But just doing, repetitive things where they're super easy, that's not actually teaching the team much. And I think the Air Force and DoD in general do a really, really good job of embedding that into your DNA. Test, I think what I took away from that is risk isn't really just about you. Risk is about the program, risk is about the other people, risk is about the people coming after you. And so in NASA especially, we are doing a whole bunch of development of the Artemis program, but it's really not about the loss of crew statistics for the first vehicle. It's like, how does that extend to the program? How do if you lose a vehicle, losing the crew is obviously horrible, but you lose the program. The program is dead in the water for 5 to 10 years. Congress is going to shut it down. The American people are going to shut it down. So we have a bigger responsibility than just yourself and self-preservation. You guys, I think, are already learning about tactical, operational, strategic levels, but just realize that the way you lead, the way you manage, the way you interact, just because it worked one place doesn't mean it's going to work somewhere else. And anyone who's done a staff job in cadets, you'll eventually wind up there, you will figure out that just because it worked in an ops squadron does not mean it's going to work on a staff job. You have to change the way you lead and be flexible and know your audience. Yeah, this one's a big one, and that's where I learned it. Knowing when you effed up and owning it and being okay with that and having the faith in your leadership to know that if it was a legitimate, honest mistake versus a malicious mistake, that everyone's going to be okay with that and you'll move on. And I kind of alluded to this before, but you have to, besides the technical skills, there's a whole lot of self-improvement that has to happen to really work effectively on a team. All right, you guys are probably going to get everyone's version of these over the week or next few days. My personal takeaways, if I would reflect back on the top 3 things that I think have helped me and helped as I've observed other leaders. One is empathy, and I think as you are even here in the wing, like as you're a firstie, the tendency to think like, oh man, and I know for myself, just hearing my other classmates talk like, oh, that's so easy now at the academy, and just that constant battle, like, oh, it's always so easy, and in the Air Force, like as you moved up, forgetting what it was like. If you're a colonel, forgetting how bad it sucked as a second lieutenant trying to figure out how to get your travel into DTS, right? Not forgetting those really painful administrative things that you start to take for granted, and doing that, but balancing the other part as a leader, avoiding the trap of getting sucked into the solution space for that. And what I specifically mean is, so I'll steal Brene Brown, if you're familiar with her. She does a really good job of explaining this empathy versus sympathy, and she uses the analogy of a pit. And so, like, let's say someone's in the pit, and like, man, it sucks down here in the pit. And sympathy is like, yeah, that really sucks. Good luck with that. I don't know how you got down there. Sucks to be you. Empathy is going down in the pit with them, feeling the emotion with them. But as a leader, where it can be hard is if you try to solve the problem, you'll burn out. There's just so much you can do, and it's not your job to solve it, but it is your job to feel it with them and be that to empathize with them. Humility. I think so many of our ethical failures, and one of the things that chaps me is all the ethical classes we have to take at lower grades because there's failings at really senior leaders, and it's like, we obviously know what the right thing to do is, it's just we forget that somewhere along the way. And I think my personal perception is it's like we think we're entitled to something as you move on, and it kind of goes back to forgetting what it was like. And you're not entitled to anything. Like I mentioned early on, I've been working, living off the taxpayer for 26 of my 40-year career, getting paid to learn. And so I owe it back to the taxpayer. I owe it to you to do my job. I'm not entitled to anything. And then accountability. So, you're underclassmen if you're an upperclassman, you're enlisted airman if you're a second lieutenant, your subordinate superior relationship. They don't expect you to be perfect, but they do expect you to be honest and to admit that you've made a mistake. That doesn't mean you need to wallow in it. That doesn't mean you need to drag the whole unit down with you, but you do have to be honest about it and move on. And I think this last bullet's something that you probably inherently know, but especially you cadets that are going to be doing this, you have a job that there is no other equal. Parents are assuming and putting their trust in you to take care of their sons and daughters, and that I hope that's never lost on you. I talk about that, we put the same faith in our flight control team, and we honestly, I forget that sometimes. I had a meeting where one of the flight controllers was like, oh, I can't believe after I made this comment, you just accepted it and moved on. I'm like, yeah, why wouldn't I? I have complete faith in that if you say this is safe, I completely trust you with that. Why would I not? But it set the bid again for me, like, this is a big deal. The parents trust you with their kids' lives, and that's a big deal. All right, a little bit of geopolitics minus the geo. So we had this picture before. Yeah, that's the Earth view. So there's 7 of us on the space station. 2 of those people are cosmonauts, and there's obviously some things happening on the ground that are very interesting between the Russian and U.S. relations. So while I was up there, about 48 hours after we'd gotten to the space station, we had to shelter in place, get ready to evacuate the station because the Russians had done an anti-satellite test and endanger the station. So that was our first exposure to that. I honestly didn't even know what had happened, so the call up to us was basically waking us up, letting us know that we had what's called a conjunction event, and then starting to prep, getting in the suits, getting the station sealed up. And it wasn't until which rightfully so, I didn't even know why. We talk about in the Air Force directive and then descriptive comm, which was this is that, like, get in your suits, get in the spacecraft. We'll tell you why later. And the why later was the anti-satellite test. The other big event, obviously, was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which happened while we were on the station. I will say there's a big difference between how it played out on orbit versus on the ground. And we almost felt guilty, quite honestly, on orbit, because to us there was no change. And it's because at the operational level, Anton and Pyotr, we had jobs to do, and our job was to keep the crew safe, keep the vehicle safe, and keep doing our job day to day. There was definitely, obviously, big things happening on the ground, but day to day and in mission control, it was pretty much business as usual. I'll say for the families, it was a much different experience. So when you have like tweets coming out, things, nuclear alert increases, videos of coming out from, showing Mark Vande Hei getting left behind on the station, that's obviously pretty stressful on the families, and then that translates into stress to the crew. I will say at the working level on the crew, it was pretty clear, like, that's BS. We're not going to leave you behind. Clearly, we're just going to keep doing our job. And I think the best analogy, hence why the picture's there, just like at Thanksgiving, you shouldn't probably talk about politics. We don't talk about politics up there at the dinner table because it's not going to really lead anywhere, and it's not really, honestly, it doesn't impact anything we're doing operationally. And so there was really no change to what we were doing day to day. And right now where we're at is the only place we are still congenial with the Russians in terms of international relations is the space program. And I think if and when this conflict comes to resolution, that will be the building block of how we eventually normalize relations. This is the only place we're really still talking. All right, so closing thoughts. Academy from space. I was not skilled enough to, I think in the past some people have been able to get their class year in rocks. I was not able to do that, but that is my story. With that, I will open it up to Q&A. I won't put Hans on the spot, but if no one else asks anything, I will. And Rachel, are you calling or you want me to just?
Yes, so we do have time for a few questions
Okay.
if they want to come to the mic stands down on the sides here. But yeah.
Oh, there's Hustler too. All right. My eyes are slowly adjusting to the lights.
Hi, sir. Cadet First Class Harshbarger from CS39. As you've mentioned before, you've worn several hats that are constantly changing. Which one do you think was most impactful for your development?
Let's see. Honestly, I think the cadet hat was the most impactful. If I look back on my career, I think I've pretty much to a T, when I compare my other experiences, whether it's UPT, test pilot school, ASCAN, I think my academy time was definitely the most difficult marathon I've run, if you will, and I think the most formative time of, like, if I look at who I was as a high school student versus who I was as a second lieutenant, like completely different completely different people. And I've definitely had major paradigm shifts and major changes in styles as I've gone, but I don't think such a fundamental personal change as I did from the academy.
Thank you, sir.
Yep.
Good morning, sir. I'm Lena Cashin from the Aerospace Corporation. Thank you for sharing your experience with us this morning. I had a couple questions, but I'll just focus on Russian relations. I was wondering when they had the ASAT test, if you noticed that the Russians were pre-warned about that at all. And also, if you could just explain more about how the interaction is with the Russians, because we've heard there's been some safety of flight issues that might have been caused by some corrupt things going on. Basically, whatever insight you could share, that would be great.
Yep. All right, I will be careful. This is also being streamed to lots of places. I will say, I can say they had no forewarning, so they were just as surprised as we were. I think if you put yourself in their shoes, the cosmonaut shoes, it was kind of a big moment of cognitive dissonance because you, as an example, you had to talk about it in the third person. Like someone did this. Like, well, you know, the someone is your own government, right? So that would be, if you were in those same shoes, if you were an Air Force officer in a situation where your own country did something, you're like, wow, how do I mentally deal with that? So the short answer is no, they didn't have any forewarning. In terms of your other question, I would say that we have what's called there's a liaison office in Moscow and a liaison office in Houston, basically each other's places. I wouldn't probably call it safety of flight issues, of more different ways of doing analysis. So we are very much in lockstep. There's a function called the IMMT, which does basically any major dynamic event, they have to get international buy-in on for any, like so in the progress left, the undocking, the deorbit, all that stuff does get approved. I would say that there's, if it is a decision that can be isolated to like only have an effect on the Russian segment, then we will probably let that happen, if that makes sense, because it's not. We do have faith and confidence in their engineering process. The communication is always not great at the higher levels. At the working levels, we're always very confident. And now it's more of I'd say, a communication challenge than an actual technical challenge. And so there have been times where like maybe some crew know more of the technical background than the other crew, just because of what control center communicated up. So I think there's differences in philosophy of how you interact with the crew and flight operations, more so than the technical concerns. But it manifests itself as technical concerns because there's a communication void, if you will, and then there's like, oh man, what about this? What about that? Are we thinking, does someone have an answer to that? So it manifests itself that way, but I think at a working level, when there's actually a safety concern, it definitely gets elevated. And then we come up with mitigation. So not to say that we don't take risks. We definitely take risks. We take risks all through spaceflight. So we do that, and then just try to figure out, okay, if we're going to do this, how can we mitigate the possible impacts, knowing what we know?
Time for one more quick question.
See one more.
Hello, I'm C4C Cassie Sams, Cadet Squadron 39, and I wanted to ask how the team atmosphere and relationships you built in space impacted your relationships with friends and family when you came back home.
That's a great question. Actually, one we're wrestling with right now as an office. So we are actually, our psych team, or we call it behavioral health team, is actually pulling on some DoD connections, because one thing we have not done a great job of at NASA is learning from the long war and the experience of DoD and how you reintegrate people when you come home. Is you're spot on. It's and it's only something that is getting talked about more now, I think, than it was in the past, but it is very disruptive. So it's no different than coming back from a deployment and trying to reintegrate with your family. And so we have the tool sets and we know how to do that. NASA we've worked a lot on the we do really good on the in-flight, and on the post-flight, sort of the mentality has been like, give you time off, let you do your thing, and just hands off. And that worked okay with the purely Soyuz model, where you had one American riding with 2 other Russians, and because you're like an individual US person. But in this age of the commercial crew, where we have the Dragon and now soon the Starliner, with 4 to 7 US crew working like as a highly efficient team, really cranking through work, it's very similar to small unit teams in the Air Force, where you're deployed, you're doing the thing that you've trained all your life for, very high performing, very efficient, like kind of tip of the spear. And then you come back, it's like, all right, I got to get the kids to soccer, the trash day is tomorrow, the garbage disposal stuff. And so it's a very like, whoop, like how do you like make that mental shift really quickly? And there is both a guilt and depression's a strong word, but a missing, right? There's a void, because those people you've been working and living with for 6 months are suddenly like gone. And then you feel guilty, like why am I not happy to be back with my family? I should be thankful I'm back with my family. And I'll also steal Brene Brown, but I think it comes from DOD, and pardon my language, she calls it the miss you, fuck you mentality. Like after about 24 hours of return from deployment, the first 24 hours, like, oh, this is awesome, you're back. And then after 24 hours, like, why don't you go back? It was better when you were gone. You're disrupting the entire system. We had a thing, we had a routine. And so it's very similar coming back home from a space station deployment. So we are pulling on that expertise that already exists in DoD to sort of revamp how we reintegrate. But it is actually something that's being talked about now, because we have larger groups of people doing that mission for long periods of time in a confined space, and then coming back. And the model to say, like, we'll see you in 6 months doesn't really work. Very good question.
Colonel Chari, thank you again for your time today. Your experiences and perspectives speak to how we can reimagine leadership and inspire teamwork. Now, on behalf of the U.S. Air Force Academy and our National Character and Leadership Symposium, please accept this token of our gratitude. And the base of this gift is made from marble from our terrazzo.
wow.
And this is significant to us, as you know, because all cadets, freshmen especially, have had to run the marble strips during their freshman year. And we hope you will look on this and remember your NCLS experience fondly.
Thanks very much. That's awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. Oh, picture? Oh, the standard is the case. All right.
So this concludes our speaker session. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Cadets, please check in for this session using the posted QR code. Thank you and have a great NCLS day.